All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Violet Arma. I'm Curatorial Assistant and Administrative Support here at the University of Arizona Museum of Art. And I'm so excited to welcome you to this virtual engagement this evening, which is Surrealism in Arizona with Mark Rownd, who is here with us today, all the way from Sedona. And to begin, I want to get started with our land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. The university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community support and service. At the institutional level, we must be proactive in broadening awareness throughout campus and beyond to ensure our students and community members feel represented and valued. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about what native lands you inhabit, if you're not here in Tucson, please visit the link in the chat. So this talk is in conjunction with an exhibition that's up at the museum right now, A Century of Surrealism. And this exhibition will be open through February 1st. So if you're not in town, or if you are, you have plenty of time to see it. This exhibition celebrates 100 years of surrealism and includes influences and participants from the movement from the mid-1920s and 1980s. Among the works that are included in this exhibition are Max Ernst's Arizona Nightingale, pictured here on the right, and Dorothea Tanning's Portofino pocketbook that's pictured on the left. In 1946, the two artists moved from New York City to the town of Sedona, Arizona. They're pictured here with Max Ernst's sculpture, Capricorn. And the pair produced works shown in museums around the world and initiated Sedona's rise as an artistic center. So our special guest today, Mark, is owner of Capricorn Hill, which is the home Ernst and Tanning shared in Sedona. He is extremely knowledgeable on the subject of surrealism and has organized several exhibitions on the history of the pair, Ernst and Tanning, in Sedona. I will let Mark introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his video essay that we'll be viewing this evening, Dorothea Tanning, Early Influences in Sedona. So go ahead and take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Violet. I am sitting in Dorothea Tanning's studio as we speak here in Sedona. And how did I get involved in all of this is a good starting point, maybe. I got my art degrees in Houston at Rice University, and I was very fortunate to attend a program that the Menil family had started at Rice University. And I don't know how many people are familiar with Dominique de Menil, but she may be the largest American collector that most people haven't heard of. But she's responsible for not only beginning that art program at Rice, but she built the Menil Museum, the Rothko Chapel, Cy Twombly Gallery, probably has a collection of more Max Ernst than anyone else in America, maybe in the world. It's in the hundreds. So at any rate, I was very fortunate to sort of grow up in an arts program where Max had a considerable presence. Now, I had no idea till about 10 years ago. We'd been living in Sedona for a decade, and finally dawned on me that we lived around the corner from Max Ernst and Dorothea Tanning's house, and I began to wonder if anybody had ever really done anything about it. And it turns out a couple of people had tried, Bill Gunning and Jan Sitz. No one had any success with the city in preserving it as a historical property. So I just kind of took it on as a project, and suddenly 10 years has gone by. Never in a million years would I have thought I would be sitting as co-owner of Capricorn Hill giving a lecture someday, but at any rate, here we are. So as I began my I realized very few people in Sedona knew anything about Sedona's own history. So I thought it was important for me to embark on that mission. And I started organizing a number of exhibitions and started buying as much of their work as I could afford. And ultimately, that led to uh, being able to acquire Capricorn Hill about 3 years ago. So that has put me in touch with scholars around the world who are interested in surrealism and interested in Max and Dorothea's history here. My mentor at Rice in art history was William Canfield, who organized the exhibition at the MoMA with the Menil Foundation in 1993, and that was called Dada and the Dawn of Surrealism. But very interestingly, that exhibition at MoMA ended with what may have been Max's first painting in Sedona from 1943, Vox Angelica. And for some reason, that planted a seed in my brain that there was probably a lot of unknown history here, and I think that turned out to be true. So, I started digging, sometimes literally with my shovel, that's not an exaggeration, in this time capsule that we have here, trying to discover what happened here, what art did they make, who visited. And so the presentation you're about to see was part of my research that I presented at the International Society for the Study of Surrealism in 2022, where I'm trying to share with as many scholars as possible some of the things that I'm digging up. So I don't know if that's enough of an intro, but if it is, we can move forward.
I think so. I think that was perfect. Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Greetings from Capricorn Hill. Dorothea Tanning, Early Influences in Sedona. While the influence of Native American art and culture on Max Ernst's artwork during his time in Arizona has been a subject of great interest, little has been explored about similar influences on the early work of Dorothea Tanning during her formative years in Sedona. At the time of Max and Dorothea's first stay in Sedona in 1943, Dorothea recalled it was so sparsely populated it couldn't even be described as a village. In Max's biographical notes, he shared memories of their stay and noted only 16 people lived in Sedona at the time. Yet Max and Dorothea had entered a landscape that had been previously inhabited by Native Americans for millennia. Verde Valley shows archaeological evidence of inhabitation over 10,000 years ago. The multitude of red rock ruins suggest a Native American population once in the thousands. However, the sites were abandoned in the 1400s for reasons which are a matter of some mystery, well before the arrival of Spanish explorers in 1540 and 1583. Some have speculated it was due to an extended drought, while others suggest that it was simply Hopi migration. Certain locations are considered sacred by the Hopi, Navajo, and Yavapai Apache, and feature prominently in their oral histories, mythologies, and ceremonies, which have been passed down for centuries. Jesse Walter Fuchs explored sites and ruins in the region in 1895 and published reports with the Smithsonian. Edward Curtis visited the Hopi Pueblos northeast of Sedona many times between 1900 and 1919 and photographed the Hopi extensively. Many Hopi legends and mythologies, as well as his photographs, are published in Volume 12 of the North American Indian in 1922. Shakea Ranch, the guest ranch where Max and Dorothea rented cottages in 1943 as temporary studio spaces, was owned and operated by artist Lillian Wilhelm Smith. Lillian had already been exploring and painting Native American sites and ceremonies in Arizona for 30 years. Best known as Zane Grey's illustrator, she first came to Arizona in 1913 to paint illustrations for Riders of the Purple Sage. Lillian was of German descent and had been considered a child prodigy. She had studied at the National Academy of Design, the Art Student League, Columbia University, and the Leonia School of Art. Lillian was believed to be the first Anglo woman to have traveled to certain remote areas of northern Arizona, including Havasu Falls. Prior to opening her guest ranch in Sedona in 1937, she operated a guest ranch and trading post by the same name on Navajo lands northeast of Flagstaff. There she offered visits to the Hopi Pueblos to witness dances and ceremonies, as well as week-long tours of hidden canyons and ruins. The dining hall boasted views of the snow-capped San Francisco peaks in the distance. While Lillian often painted locations central to Native American legends in the region, her paintings were representational of the landscape in the setting. Here's an image of Lillian painting plein air, a photograph of her accompanying Zane Grey on a journey to Rainbow Bridge in 1922. Here's a photo of her painting Rainbow Bridge, and this is the painting. According to Navajo legend, the arch was formed by a male and female rainbow person coming together in union and frozen in time. Next is an image of a Kachina dance, which Lillian painted in 1925. Lillian's guest ranch in Sedona was on land originally owned by Sedona's namesake, Sedona Schnebley's family. Sedona's home functioned as the town's original hotel, post office, and general store. The original home was lost to a fire, and the property later purchased by George Black, who built a small stone home called the Stone House at that location. In 1937, Lillian purchased the property, and she named it Shakea Ranch. Lillian's husband, Jesse, built the rustic cottages, which Max and Dorothea rented. Her cottages rented for $100 per month or $250 for 3 months. Without lights or running water in the cottages, Max and Dorothea likely joined Lillian for meals in the main house. Lillian was a direct descendant of 17th century German polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, an important figure in the history of mathematics, science, and philosophy, which of course was of great interest to Max and a source of inspiration for his painting Vox Angelica, with its many Leibnizian references. Max later recalled how they first learned of the guest ranch from a fellow exile, and noted in considerable detail the landscape, the wildlife, and plant life of Oak Creek Canyon, as well as the hospitality of several Indian tribes, including the Hopi. Max and Dorothea's relationship had begun only a few months prior to their 1943 Sedona adventure. Dorothea had left her illustration job at Macy's to focus on painting full-time. Dorothea later recalled that when Max moved into her apartment, along with him came an army of Kachinas, which he had acquired at the Grand Canyon Trading Post during his first trip through Arizona in 1941, many of them originally from the Hopi Pueblos northeast of Sedona. Native American art had recently been featured in 2 major exhibitions in New York. In the spring of 1941, the MoMA featured the exhibition Indian Art of the United States. In mid-October 1942, the exhibition First Papers of Surrealism opened, featuring Native American artworks displayed alongside Surrealist artworks. Unsure of their next move after the 31 Women exhibition, Max and Dorothea decided to leave New York and head to Sedona to paint. Dorothea would later recall that her life experience was as if it could have been split in 2 before and after Arizona. Many of her early paintings from Sedona would soon be exhibited at her first solo exhibition at Julian Levy Gallery the following year. Yet Dorothea included only a few lines about her first experience in Sedona in 1943, in Birthday and In Between Lives. In Birthday, she recalled, "At first it was to be a way to spend the summer. A landscape of such wild fantasy could not, however, be classified and forgotten when summer was over. Less than 3 years later, we were back to stay." More than just summer, postcards from Max to photographer friend Frederick Sommer reflect that they stayed in Sedona well into October. While Dorothea may have written few details in her books, her artworks offer clues as to the locations and sites they visited, as well as their associated Native American mythologies. Cathedral Rock, which Dorothea mentions briefly in Birthday, is one of the most iconic red rock formations in Sedona, arguably the most photographed spot by tourists. The entrance to the park is known today as Crescent Moon Ranch, on the west side of Cathedral Rock. A century ago, it was a large orchard, cannery operation, and produced fruit and vegetables and grain sold over a wide region. In 1936, the Baldwin family acquired the property and installed a large water wheel for irrigation and domestic use. The water wheel is a landmark familiar to tourists today near the entrance to the trail alongside Oak Creek. Dorothea's drawing, Simplified Botany, The Land, 1943, shows the recognizable landmark, the water wheel near Cathedral Rock. The drawing also accurately renders the water level of the irrigation channel. Only a half-mile to the east of Cathedral Rock is one of Sedona's most popular hikes, Cathedral Rock Trail. Views to the southeast toward Courthouse Butte show evidence of Sedona's geologic past, the red rocks having been sculpted by currents while beneath the ocean multiple times, as well as having been flooded once by fresh water, the reason the rocks are red. Her painting Self-Portrait, 1944, was not painted plein air as Lillian painted her landscapes, nor was it painted from a photograph. Rather, Dorothea's surreal version of the Sedona landscape was painted from memory the next year back in New York. A sole female figure stands before a flooded canyon in the Red Rock landscape, and may be a reference to the legend of Whitapokwe and the flood of Palakawabi, ancient mythologies of Native Americans in the Sedona region. The area where Shakea Ranch once stood was developed in the 1970s into an arts village and a resort. It was originally built as an art community, a combination of gallery spaces and artists in residence. Today it's a collection of over 50 shops, galleries, and restaurants, and a highly popular destination for the millions of tourists that visit Sedona annually. The renovated stone house, visible in early photographs of Shakea Ranch and seen in the Western film Gunfighters, still stands today at Los Abrigados Resort and is available as a rental. A short walk to the creek from the stone house shows the location where Dorothea's photo was taken at Shakea Ranch in 1943. In Arizona Landscape, 1943, Dorothea references the Red Rock Formation visible across the creek from Shakea Ranch, however, reverses the image orientation as a horizontal flip, as if a photo negative. Arizona Landscape appears to combine imagery from two different locations. The body of water resembles photographs of Montezuma Well. Katrina Makara mentions in a surrealist stratigraphy of Dorothea Tanning's Chasm the possibility that the body of water in the painting is a reference to Montezuma Well. A natural limestone sinkhole 18 miles south of Shakea Ranch, it produces a flow of 1.5 million gallons of water per day from an underground spring. Ruins at the site date back to the year 1050. In 1895, Jesse Walter Fuchs recorded his observations for the Smithsonian from his expedition to Arizona. He learned of the legends of Montezuma Well from Hopi elders at Walpi and speculated that the well may have been the home of Palulukan, the mythic Hopi water serpent who destroyed Palakawabi with a flood. In 1896, Fuchs published an article in American Anthropologist about two sites located near the area that would become known as Sedona. Two ruins recently discovered in the Red Rock Country, Arizona. The two sites of Red Rock cliff dwellings had been inhabited from the years 1150 to 1350. He named them Hananki and Palatki, with Palatki being named after the fabled red-walled city Palakawabi of Hopi legends, which had been destroyed by flood. Edward Curtis first visited the Hopi villages in 1900, photographing the Hopi people, and then returned 6 more times between 1902 and 1919. In 1922, a series of 20 volumes were published, with Volume 12 focused on the history, mythologies, and ceremonies of the Hopi. Page 128 describes the Soyal winter solstice ceremony. Page 240 references the flood of Palakawapi. According to A History of the Well by Park Ranger Jack Beckman, Montezuma Well is frequently visited by Hopi, Navajo, and local Yavapai Apache, who consider it a very sacred site. Some collect water for ceremonies, some come to pray, leave prayer feathers, sprinkle sacred cornmeal, or throw water over their shoulders toward the north in the direction of home and needed rain. In Arizona Landscape, the imagery of the waterfall flowing forth from the top of her head may not only be a reference to the spring that flows forth from Montezuma Well, but also what is known in Hopi as the Kopavi. Frank Waters in Book of the Hopi describes Kopavi in this way in Chapter 1, The First World. The first of these in man lay at the top of the head. Here, when he was born, was the soft spot, Kopavi, the open door through which he received his life and communicated with his Creator. Jack Beckman wrote down the Apache creation legend of Whitapokwe. which he heard often repeated by Yavapai Apache visiting Montezuma Well. Montezuma Well flooded the world, and only one person was left, a girl, Whitapokwe. She floated in a canoe until she came to a cave where she decided to live. She had a daughter whose father was the sun. The daughter produced a son. This was the beginning of the Apache people. In Dorothea's artwork, Fantastic Heliotherapy, a young girl escapes a flood by climbing a pueblo ladder, which leads to an opening in a sunflower, as if a portal into a pueblo. The imagery suggests her surrealist version of the legend of Whitapokwe, with the sun represented by a sunflower and a girl who appears to be pregnant, impacted by rays of sunlight. An account of the Whitapokwe creation story of the southeastern Yavapai was published in American Archaeology and Ethnology in 1932 by E.W. Gifford and includes several additional local details. Whitapokwe survived the flood as her hollowed-out pine tree canoe became stranded on San Francisco Mountain. She went south to the Red Rock country on the east side of the Verde River, across from Jerome. There she bore a daughter begotten by the sun. Interestingly, as the legend might suggest, the Navajo, Yavapai Apache, and Hopi are matrilineal societies. Among the Hopi, women own the property, and Hopi clans rise and fall with the generations of female heirs. Concerning the title, heliotherapy is the therapeutic use of sunlight for healing of certain health conditions. Between 1880 and 1945, Arizona was the most popular destination in the U.S. prescribed for heliotherapy. In Dorothea's painting Rapture, 1944, the sun is represented as a sunflower radiating light over a landscape, reminiscent of the view of Verde Valley towards Sedona as seen from Jerome. Interestingly, Lillian Wilhelm Smith was credited as the first artist to paint a view of Verde Valley from Mingus Mountain. The sunflower as sun suggests Native American representations of Tawa, the sun kachina, creator of the first world. Here's an image of Tawa, the sun spirit kachina. Most Hopi creation stories center around Tawa, the sun spirit. Tawa is the creator, and it was he who formed the first world out of endless space, as well as its original inhabitants, Harold Kuhlander, the fourth world of the Hopi. There were other friends in Max and Dorothea's sphere, in addition to Lillian, who had interaction with Native Americans in the region. Helen Fry, a close friend of Max and Dorothea's, built a large home southwest of Cathedral Rock, reminiscent of a Hopi pueblo, and filled her home with a collection of Native American art and artifacts. Here's a photograph of Dorothea holding up Kachina next to Max and possibly Jimmy partying at Helen Fry's home. Helen's home was built by local Yavapai Apache workers and became known as the House of Apache Fires. She was often visited by the Hopi, Navajo, as well as Yavapai Apache. Helen was invited to ceremonies that were not open to the public, and reportedly had sacred ceremonies performed at her home. Helen's home and acreage eventually became Red Rock State Park. Photographs from Patrick Wahlberg's visit in January 1947 show that Max began construction of sections of Capricorn at Helen Fry's home, until the problem of water was solved at Capricorn Hill that summer. Andre Breton had made a trip to the Hopi Mesas in Arizona for 3 weeks in August 1945. Breton logged detailed notes in the manner of an anthropologist, recording observations of ceremonies and dances. He reported that 1,000 visitors witnessed the serpent dance at Walpi. When Lee Miller and Roland Penrose visited Capricorn Hill in the summer of '46, Max and Dorothea took them to the Hopi Pueblos to watch ceremonial dances and rituals. Of the visit, Roland wrote, "Most impressive of all was the Hopi reservation, where from a housetop we joined in the compulsive rhythms of the masked Kachina dancers. Max had already made friends with the Hopi and had a splendid collection of some of their most extraordinary Kachina dolls." In Birthday, Dorothea recounts the story of a return to Arizona from a long trip to France and winding their way across the U.S. by car. In New Mexico, they visited the Acoma Pueblo, and for the price of $1, They witnessed a dance at sunset of masked dancers and tribesmen, surrounded by women, children, and the elderly of the village. The year before Max and Dorothea first came to Sedona, Sun Chief, the autobiography of a Hopi Indian, was published in 1942. Hopi Sun Chief Don Taliesin was from Aribi, the ancient Hopi village in northern Arizona that's been continuously inhabited since the year 1150. Don was the Sun Chief of the Fire Clan and had overseen the Soyal ceremony for 30 years by the time Sun Chief was published. Due to the number of researchers and anthropologists he cooperated with, he became known as anthropology's most documented man. Sun Chief reported a dream to anthropologist Dorothy Egan that he would become known in Europe. He would later have a thriving correspondence with Breton after his life story was translated and published in Europe. Among Max Ernst's book collection, donated by Dorothea to the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale, was a copy of Sun Chief, which had been translated into French. Max was also known to have read Fuchs' research on Native American history in Arizona and his study of Kachinas. The Truth About Comets, 1945. The landscape is a reference to the San Francisco peaks north of Flagstaff. San Francisco Mountain is a stratovolcano, and Dorothea clearly illustrates the volcanic cone. For the Hopi, the peaks are a sacred site, home to their ancestral Kachina spirits who live on the peaks and among the clouds near the summit from summer until the winter solstice. At the winter solstice Soyal ceremony, the Kachinas dance in celebration of the sun returning toward its summer path. The Hopi determine when the winter solstice arrives by using the alignment of the sun with the San Francisco peaks. The two comets in The Truth About Comets likely represent Kachinas above the sacred peaks and may also be a reference to certain Hopi prophecies. A reference to comet Kachinas at the Kachina house in Sedona states, "The chasing star Kachina is also called the comet Kachina and planet Kachina. The Hopi differ in regard as to what this Kachina represents. Some say he represents a planet. To others, he represents a meteor streaking across the sky. Chasing star usually appears at the bean dance or at a mixed dance. His function is no longer known." The images of two females, described as mermaid figures by Dorothea's friend Joseph Cornell, might be a reference to the snake maiden of the Hopi snake myth. The staircase appears to draw from two images by Edward Curtis, the stairway trail and on a housetop, photographed at the Hopi village Walpi, published in the North American Indian, Volume 12, in 1922. Dorothea's artwork, A Guest, a costume design for The Night Shadow, a ballet in 1945, appears reminiscent of the Hopi deer dancer Kachina. Dorothea's book illustration for 3 plays, published by Black Sun Press in 1944, appears reminiscent of a Hopi eagle dancer. Thank you.
Let's see here. Stopped the share. Thank you for sticking with us through all of those technical difficulties. We're going to move into a little bit of a Q&A between Mark and myself, and if we have time at the end, we will take a look at some of your questions. So if you do have questions, you can pop them in the chat. I can't promise we'll get to them, but we sure will try. So Mark, my first question for you is, can you tell us a bit about how Tanning and Ernst influenced one another's artistic practices, and note some specific examples?
Well, I think the answer to that is pretty simple in terms of their practices. I think there was almost no influence, and I mean that's a curious aspect of their relationship. And to be honest, I think it was a reflection of the differences between Max and Dorothea's relationship and Max and Leonora Carrington's relationship, and I'll try to explain that. When Max met Dorothea, I think he considered her a fully mature artist just based on the painting Birthday alone. When he met Leonora Carrington, she was an art student and even younger than him than Dorothea was. And so later in life, Leonora said that she learned everything from Max. So they actually painted paintings together, they would draw together. They kind of melded artistically. But when the war ended that relationship and tore them apart, they never reunited, even though they both ended up escaping their circumstances and ended up in New York in 1941. I think part of the reason that they didn't reunite was on Leonora's side of things. Her understanding was that it might be difficult for her to escape the influence of Max in their relationship, because it really started imbalanced in the way of kind of like a teacher-student relationship artistically. And so I think she felt, and even a friend of hers encouraged her, that she needed to be away from Max in order to mature on her own as an artist and kind of separate herself and her identity from Max. So I think Max very much wanted to reunite with Leonora. That never happened. And so I think when the relationship began later with Dorothea, he was very careful about that boundary. And in Dorothea's memoirs, she's frustrated. She's asking Max for feedback about certain paintings, and he's giving vague answers and ironic responses and just not giving her any real input. And I remember one anecdote she tells in one of her memoirs about she's asking for feedback and not getting it. And the next day she just destroys the painting and mentions it to Max. And his only comment was, well, maybe you can do better. So that said, as I began studying Dorothea's work in more detail, I actually had a more difficult time beginning to get some grasp of her process and her creation process, and what was in her mind, in terms of the creation of this and the elements that were coming together and what she was expressing. It was more difficult for me until I began to understand that she would sometimes inhabit another artist's work. She would inhabit a story or a legend or a mythology, and she would reinterpret that from her perspective and put herself in it, put herself literally in the story. So I found, some works that she was clearly referencing Max's work, including Birthday. And when I got a copy of this fabulous book, I'm going to give a little plug here for Amy Lyford's new book, Exquisite Dreams, The Art and Life of Dorothea Tanning. She gives quite a number of detailed examples of collages of Max's that Dorothea might be referencing in a painting or another artist's painting. And so as far as Max, I think there was even some tension in their relationship about his artistic process, because Dorothea was of the belief that surrealists didn't really know how to paint. And I think from a kind of a classic traditional painter's painter kind of point of view, which I fully believe Dorothea was, she was an extraordinarily capable technical painter. You had many of the other surrealists who were experimenting with processes that were not in any way classical technique. Max is credited with having invented something like 25 different techniques, processes in terms of what I think of as idea generation for starting a painting, like frottage or gouache or some technique. As an artist, I relate to that from Max's perspective, myself having, studied abstract painting, learning to be an abstract painter. the fear of the blank canvas. I mean, it's a great thing. If you can scrape some canvas or some paper on the surface and it begins to suggest some kind of imagery that you didn't have to think of or you didn't have to preconceive, that begins to give you something to respond to, the painting starts to tell you what the next step is. So maybe that's too long of an answer, but in effect, I don't really think they influenced each other very much at all in terms of their artistic practices.
No, thank you. I think that was a great answer, and I think you really illuminated, their different journeys as artists and how their relationships impacted that. So fantastic. Our next question for you, as a resident of Sedona and I'll say, surrealist expert, can you describe the influence of surrealism in Sedona in the present day, in your view?
I mean, it's a good question, and I've thought about this a lot in the past. I've been asked to, organize and jury some contemporary surrealism exhibitions, and there's obviously still a lot of surrealism influence in contemporary art today and in the artwork of Sedona artists, but I don't actually think there's a direct link in terms of any kind of a causal link to Max and Dorothea themselves, in a certain way at least. Let me try to explain that. When Max and Dorothea were here, there was no one here. Max wrote in his biographical notes there were 16 people. When they came back in 1946, there were probably a few hundred people who lived in the Oak Creek Canyon area, but they were still very early. And, in terms of the art community, it would have just been a handful of people. Now, at that time, you have world famous artists coming to visit Max and Dorothea, like Duchamp and Tanguy and Kay Sage, Lee Miller, Roland Penrose, Man Ray, Sonia Sekula, even Balanchine came here, Nabokov, but there was almost no one here. So I think their presence clearly inspired the local community that was here to form the Sedona Art Center, which was founded by a close friend of Max and Dorothea's, Egyptian sculptor named Nisanga Braun, who had moved here and was teaching. And he's credited as being the founder of the Sedona Art Center. So I think Max and Dorothea's presence here actually helped inspire that happening. They were actually in the opening show. And Nisanga Braun, isn't really known for a major contribution he made to modern art history in that he actually prepared the molds of Capricorn that were in the backyard here at the house, which was what Max used for the 8 monumental bronzes that are in various museums around the world, like the Pompidou and the Menil and the National Gallery of Art. So Dorothea considered the Surrealism movement basically to have ended in 1949 when Julian Levy Gallery closed. Julian Levy Gallery closed. He was discouraged by the abstract expressionist movement. He wasn't a fan of abstract expressionism. And obviously, America won the war, and the interest in European surrealism had faded in terms of the market substantially, and that was what Julian Levy was all about. In fact, I'm going to give another pitch for a book. I don't know if I have it here, but the Levy Foundation, Marie, the director over there the last 40 years, has just put out a 2,200-page book on the history of the Levy Gallery, and it covers over 100 artists and 200 exhibitions, and it's filled with all kinds of unknown research, including 120 pages on Max and Dorothea from their records, and 90 pages on Frida Kahlo, who had her first solo exhibition there. And it's an extraordinary piece of work. They spent 15 years on it. But from Dorothea's perspective, she thought of the Surrealism movement as having ended in 1949, which of course it didn't. There was a major exhibition at the Metropolitan just a couple of years ago, which attempted to survey 80 years of the Surrealism movement across 45 countries. So I'm giving you a very long answer in that Surrealism is still alive. It metastasized despite, it falling out of favor due to the abstract expressionist movement, at least in New York during that, the marketing of art, but it's still present. And I think, a large number of artists, even in the Sedona community, are still using elements of surrealism in their work. And it's as if part of the history here went global and has come back, but there's almost not a direct linkage, if that makes any sense.
Yes, absolutely. I think anyone who's visited Sedona, who's had the privilege, knows it's a very special place, and having the tie of two major surrealist figures there is an incredible thing, but doesn't necessarily mean that there's profound influence beyond what the influence has been globally. So, and fantastic. Our next question for you is, why do you think that Tanning and Ernst were so attracted to Sedona and the Southwest in general? They lived other places, I think, that might be considered more artistic centers. So what do you think drew them to coming to somewhere like Sedona?
Well, I think it was Max's inspiration to be here. Sedona is a very surreal place. I mean, if you come here, you're impacted by the environment. It's impossible not to be. But when Max first came through Arizona in 1941, he was actually on a trip with Peggy Guggenheim, who had flown him from New York to Los Angeles to get him away from Leonora Carrington. And for the return trip, they bought a car, and Jimmy speaks to this profound moment as they're driving through Arizona and stopping the car for a 6-foot rattlesnake in the road. Max steps out of the car and he sees this glorious, surreal landscape of Red Rock Mountains, and reportedly had this kind of profound deja vu that he didn't realize that such a place actually existed. He'd been painting Red Rock Mountain landscapes already in his paintings, and you can witness that just by going back and looking at prior works before he ever came here. Now, I've sort of questioned that legend because obviously Sedona was in a lot of movies and in a lot of westerns already by that time, and perhaps he'd seen a western. But on the other hand, very likely they were all in black and white, so it may well be a truth. So, I think he had, a very strong sense of destiny about wanting to come back here. And then the other important aspect of it was the Hopi. The Surrealists had been studying Hopi since the mid-1920s. And even in fact, Carl Jung himself had come to study the Hopi, believe it or not. It's kind of a remarkable full circle in terms of Surrealist interest in Freudian Jungian theories of dreams and dreaming. But here in Arizona, you've got the Hopi who have been focused on that for millennia. So I think there was an obvious sympathy between the Hopi and their beliefs and the Surrealism movement and their beginning awareness of the Freudian and Jungian theories of the unconscious mind or collective unconscious. So the Hopi were a huge draw for Max. And when he and Peggy stopped at the Grand Canyon Trading Post, I think he bought out the entire trading post of Cucina's, I'm sure, with Peggy's money. And there's that famous photograph that was in the video when Max returned to New York. And the house here in Sedona was completely populated with Cucina's. Now I understand, from later scholarship that those were very likely just tourist Cucina's in terms of the type of art and artifact that would intentionally be created for the tourism trade. Nonetheless, they were very powerful images for Max, and they still affected him. So when Max got back to New York, he wanted to come back to Sedona, to Arizona. Peggy was too busy. She was making plans to open Art of the Century there, and just simply didn't have the time to come back to Arizona. But Dorothea was up for the adventure, obviously, and I read most all of the letters in their correspondence that I've been able to find in the archives that I have access to. And in one letter, Max recounted when they're actually moving here, that they both felt like they had 10 times the amount of energy to paint in Sedona than they had in New York. So I think those are the reasons, but a lot of it was actually that it was a great place to paint, and removed from all the busyness of New York and the art events and all the socializing, just trying to isolate themselves here to paint. Although in Dorothea's memoir, when they finally got their initial phase of their house built, she lamented they had something like 47 guests in 44 days, which kind of defeated the purpose of being here, but obviously that didn't last forever. So they were terribly prolific here, and I honestly think the main reason they came here was to isolate themselves to make art.
Thank you. All right, we only have a few minutes left here, so I'll kind of tag on an audience question with one of our questions here. So on a personal note, Mark, when did you first become interested in surrealism, and what attracted you to the movement? And to tag on a little bit of an audience question, could you also share a little bit about what people should do if they want to visit Capricorn Hill in Sedona if they're more locally located?
Well, to answer the last part first, you can just go to capricornhill.org, and there's a contact form, and that email will come to me, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone about how to facilitate coming and seeing the place. And we actually have a guest house that quite a number of scholars have stayed at. We're going to be hosting the director of the Max Ernst Museum in the guest house, and later this fall, and a number of scholars have come here and stayed to do research and just learn more about what happened here, what art was made here, sometimes art that they studied or art they have in their museum collections. I think as far as surrealism was kind of unavoidable for me. I mean, going to college at Rice in a program that was started by Dominique de Menil, there would be no way to avoid surrealism, even if I had wanted to. So particularly with a professor, my main mentor, who did the catalog raisonné for Picabia and organized the retrospective at the MoMA. I didn't even know until I started this project. Max came to my art school. He came the semester before I started for a major retrospective that Dominique de Menil organized. I found a 1-hour documentary. It's online. Anyone can watch it. It's called Max Ernst Hanging, and the name of the retrospective was inside the site, and it was in 1973. And I was shocked to see Max walking around my art school, looking at all these paintings from Sedona. That was quite a moment for me when I didn't even know that had happened. So, I mean, as far as any other reason in terms of why I might be attracted to surrealism, I found learning how to paint an abstract painting extremely difficult. And it was not a simple hurdle. And so I think the surrealist process of their concept of how to begin a painting, what the inspiration for a painting was, from these very abstract sources, the idea of the unconscious mind or some kind of automatic process. I think that's very connected to the abstract expressionist movement, and probably the biggest piece of what the abstract expressionist movement took from the surrealists. Now, I know we're probably running out of time, but I want to mention one more thing. I haven't ever read any essays about this, but I would encourage everyone to read the essay that Barnett Newman wrote for the opening exhibition at the Betty Parsons Gallery. I have a copy of it here, and it's probably not enough time for me to read this, but it's a remarkable piece because this is late 1946, and America has won the war. The abstract expressionists are building momentum, and they would like to disavow that the European surrealists had any influence on their process, which obviously wasn't true. You can look up paintings by Rothko and Pollock that are obviously surrealist paintings. There's even a 1945 Rothko called Surrealism. And it's got all kinds of elements of Max, but Barnett wanted to deny that there was any influence. I think a big part of it was this swell of American pride, and that they wanted to brand the abstract expressionist movement as being purely American. But what's interesting to me about the essay is that the opening exhibition at Betty Parsons Gallery wasn't any of their art. It was Northwest Coast Indian Art was the name of the exhibition. And they actually borrowed some of Max's collection from the Northwest Coast area to be a part of the exhibition. And in the essay, Barnett Newman claims the authority for the abstract expressionist movement as being derived from Native American art. That their art was a pure form of abstraction that was so advanced that the modern mind couldn't even comprehend it. I think that's an important piece of art history, and it puts a direct link between the influence in the artist's minds and the importance of indigenous art in actually the founding of the modern art movement. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark.